Hi, today we'll be comparing the Ryzen 5800X and 5800X 3D when using an RTX 4080. When doing my research I noticed that there's plenty of great videos comparing the CPUs when using the 4090, but nothing really out there for us 4080 peasants. So I decided to do a couple of videos to help others decide for themselves whether it's a worthwhile upgrade for them. So let's do it. Our system today is an ASUS TUF Gaming X570, a palette 4080 with 32GB of Corsair Vengeance, 3200MHz DDR4 CL16 RAM. The games are installed on a Sabrent Rocket Gen 4 NVMe drive, and the CPU is cooled with a Deepcool AK620. I use Windows 10 Home in this comparison and had SAM enabled on all games. Starting with Miles Morales. I found in this game you get a lot more frames when swinging around the city than you do when walking or fighting, so I've taken all my data from the ground to give a worst case scenario. 4K very high, we see the X3D beating the X by a small margin with much better 0.1% lows. Adding RT very high seems to slightly favour the X model until you turn on DLSS quality to get a more playable experience, giving the 3D a nice advantage here. Both systems are starting to look CPU limited with DLSS balance though. For those of you who don't like using upscaling or just prefer a higher frame rate but still want some RT goodness, we turn down at RT high, giving the X3D a 7% advantage and a 19% boost to average FPS when adding DLSS quality, neither making any noteworthy gains with DLSS balance though. Turning down to high settings we see similar results to very high with a slight boost for both CPUs, the X3D leading by 3% average and 7% in 0.1% lows. Adding RT very high, the CPUs are matched except the 3D has an 11% boost to 1% lows. When adding DLSS, the 5800X hits a wall, performing worse than it did at very high settings with DLSS balanced. This gives the 5800X 3D a 17% lead using both CPUs' highest results. Turning down the RT to high has the 3DX 6% faster with a nice boost to 0.1% lows, both CPUs limited with DLSS, meaning you're better off with very high settings here. Also, I won't be using DLSS balance from now on because you're not getting any worthwhile gains from it at low resolutions. Here we have medium settings and we're pretty much neck and neck, but with a small boost to 1 and 0.1% lows for the 3D, both CPUs giving a nice 120 FPS experience. We won't include any RT, as both CPUs are super limited now, only gaining a couple of FPS over high settings, or losing FPS with DLSS enabled. Now we have 1440p. The 3D crushes the X by 27% here with 51% better 1% lows and 38% smoother 0.1. Adding RT very high sees the 5800X become CPU limited, gaining nothing when using DLSS, allowing the X3D a 10% lead without and a massive 23% with DLSS, with good gains in 1 and 0.1% lows too. We'll skip RT high here as we're already seeing CPU limits at this res. Moving on to high settings we see massive gains here, the X3D 33% faster with 61% better 1 and 43% better 0.1% lows. It's looking like the 5800X is really starting to get close to its limits. And when we add RT, the 5800X has nothing left to give, actually getting worse than at very high settings in some areas. Now we have medium settings and the X3D destroys the standard X model here, leading by a massive 38% average, 36% 1% lows and 30% 0.1% lows. Moving over to 1080p at very high settings, the X3D has a 33% lead and a 28% boost to 1% and 25% to 0.1% lows, with gains of 23% average, 24% 1% lows and 21% 0.1% lows when adding RT very high. Both CPUs are already limited here, so we'll keep it simple and leave DLSS. And we'll finish up on high settings at 1080p. We're completely CPU limited, pretty much matching or getting worse than very high settings here. That's it for Spider-Man, on to the next game. Now we have a Plague Tale Requiem. Amazing graphics in this one. Data was recorded with 3 1-minute runs per setting in the first hide and seek section of the game. I decided to use DLSS 2 here as it gives a really good boost, and there isn't much performance gain from turning down the settings, averaging 4 to 5 FPS. 4K the CPUs are pretty much neck and neck, staying within a couple of percent of each other, except for the 0.1% lows which are a bit up and down for some reason. The 3D winning some and the X winning others. (1440p) is similar at high settings, but the 3D does start to pull away at low settings. Seems the 0.1% lows in this game are a bit all over the place. Both CPUs trade in blows in this area depending on the settings, so I'm not sure how much notice should really be taken of this metric. At 1080p the X model is CPU limited straight away and gains barely any frames going down in settings. The X3D scales a little better, allowing for 24% better averages with a 21% boost to 1% lows at best. At 1080p low I recorded a huge discrepancy in 0.1% lows with the X3D, with a 60 frame difference between runs going from 60 to 120 FPS. So with either CPU at any resolution, there isn't much point going down below Ultra with DLSS quality, or even just Ultra when using lower resolutions than 4K. So although the X3D can beast the 5800X at low settings, really isn't worth the upgrade in this particular game. The 0.1% lows aren't really to be trusted either, as I'm pretty sure it's an issue with the game and not any particular CPU. Anyway, now we have Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition to test out a little bit more ray tracing. In this game I didn't turn RT off as you're already getting pretty good FPS with it, so I might as well just leave it enabled. Same with DLSS below quality settings. Thought I'd just keep this one simple. Data was taken from the start of the Sam's Story DLC. Starting with 4K Ultra we see the 5800X already showing some good games with a 5% boost averages, 12% to 1% lows, and an extra 18% to 0.1%. Closing the gap a little when adding DLSS here in 1 and 1% lows, but the averages have an extra 1% in the X3D's favour. Turning down to medium settings we see the X3D pull away a bit now, with 8% more average frames, 55% extra 1% lows and a massive 68% higher in 0.1% lows. Adding DLSS we see a similar pattern to Ultra. The lows are coming together now and the averages are 1% higher for the 3D. Now to 1440p Ultra, and it's looking like the CPU limit is really starting to affect the 5800X. The 3D means 30% higher in 1% lows and 78% higher in 0.1. The averages pull away too with DLSS adding a 14% gap, but reducing the 1% lows to 12%, while strangely increasing the difference to 0.1 to 84%. Down to 1440p medium, the gap between averages is increased to 15%, with the 1 and 0.1% lows at a much more reasonable 13 and 20%. With DLSS increasing the averages to 29% here, and 1% lows to 28% and 0.1% lows to 27%. At 1080p Ultra the 5800X doesn't see much improvement when adding DLSS, unlike the 5800X 3D, although the X is beating it in 0.1% lows without upscaling. The X3D beats the X by 23% here with better 1 and 0.1% lows with DLSS. We see the 5800X is completely CPU limited again at 1080p medium, though on the X3D a lot of extra frames, being 33% better with DLSS here, with 38% higher 1% lows and 37% better 0.1. Seems this game is another with unstable 0.1% lows, but it does show really good gains with the 5800X 3D at all resolutions, especially in 1% lows. increasing the smoothness of gameplay. Next we have Halo Infinite online multiplayer, and I did 6 1-minute runs over 2 separate maps to give an overall average. I used windowed mode so that I could get the correct resolution here, as the resolution scaling wouldn't let me. Starting with 4K, the 5800X3D beats the X in all settings by a slight margin, with a nice boost to 1% lows being 9% higher in Ultra and Medium and 16% better at low settings. Now we have 1440p, and the X3D is once again taking the win in Ultra and Medium settings by a few frames, with 6% better, 1% lows at Ultra, 9% at Medium and 5% at low. Although it's losing in 0.1% here, the standard X being 11% better at Ultra, 13% at Medium and 11% at low. At low settings, the 5800X actually comes out on top here, accepting 1% lows, allowing it to beat the 3D by 5% in average FPS. Finally we have 1080p, and once again Ultra and Medium are displaying very different behaviour at low. The X3D beating the X in averages by 15% at Ultra and Medium, but losing in 1% lows, and destroying the X by 27% at low, with much better 1% lows too, although it's still losing in 0.1% lows at all settings. Both CPUs are capable of pretty massive frame rates here, so unless you're chasing that 338 FPS at 1080p low, the X3D isn't a huge upgrade over the X in this game. If you are though, 27% isn't to be sniffed at. Next up is Assetto, Corsa, Competizione. I had to watch a video to say that one, and yes, I'll give it a like. We've kept this one simple as the frames are so high, even at 4K, that you'll be happy with either CPU, although there is some big differences in the CPUs in this game. Data was taken from 3 1-minute runs on the Nürburgring course. And as you'll see by my amazing driving, I'm a master of racing sims. At 4K Epic the CPUs are pretty closely matched, although the 3D does best the X and gives a nice 12% boost to 0.1% lows. Turn the settings down to medium, we see a similar gap in averages, but the 3D's lows are great here, with 26% better 1% and 38% better 0.1% lows. At 1440p the X3D beats the X by 9% average, 20% 1% lows, and has 26% better 0.1%. Moving down to medium, the 5800X is starting to look pretty limited, with the 3DX beating the X by 32% in average, 40% in 1% lows, and 37% in 0.1% lows. The 3D model allowing for a perfectly smooth 240 FPS here without a dip in sight. 1080p Epic's next, and the 5800X is showing similar results to the 1440p data, gaining only a few frames, while the X3D pulls away again with a huge 32% boost, with 60% better 1% lows and 31% 0.1. At medium both CPUs are limited now, pretty much matching the 1440p data. The 5800X does creep up a little closer to the X3D in 1 and 0.1% lows at 1080p though. As stated earlier, both CPUs allow for a lot of frames here, but the 5800X3D does provide an overall smoother experience if you want to play at really high frame rates. Battlefield 5 is up next, and we're skipping the RT on this one due to the DirectX 12 causing frame rate spikes in this title. The data was recorded on the Tirailleur story mission, with 3 1-minute runs of the start of the map per setting. Starting with 4K, the X3D's average FPS beats the X by 12% at Ultra, 14% at high and 17% at medium settings. In 1% lows we have gains of 13% at Ultra, 16% at high and 17% at medium. We get even bigger margins in 0.1% lows here. The 3D model absolutely smashing the X by 67% at Ultra. Although this does seem like a bit of an outlier, and might even out a little bit with a few more runs. Moving on to 1440p, the 5800X3D pulls away even more, being 19% faster at Ultra and 20% at high, beating the non-3D by 28% in 1 and 0.1% at Ultra, and destroying its 1% lows by 31% at high with 26% better, 0.1% lows too. We're hitting the in-game frame rate cap at medium, meaning the X3D could probably increase its lead even more if it were allowed. It also seems to cause lower 1 and 0.1% lows, so you're probably better off capping it just below or using high settings here. Lastly, we have 1080p at Ultra, and the margins increase it even more, with the X3D beating the X by 23% average, 32% 1 and 44% 0.1% lows. At high, the CPUs are a little closer together, with the X3D being slightly less smooth here, but still beating the X. Once again at medium, we have the 3D hitting the game cap, allowing the 5800X to catch up a bit more. With much smoother 1 and 1% lows in this game, the X3D is looking like a much better option if you're playing the multiplayer. Our last game in this comparison is The Witcher 3 Complete Edition. I used the DirectX 12 mode so that I could test ray tracing, and took my data from Novigrad City to give a worst case scenario. I did 3 1-minute runs of the city, making sure to go busy and quiet areas for a more realistic gameplay result. 4K with RT enabled, Witcher 3 is a complete monster, leaving both systems failing to hit even 30 FPS with RT Ultra, so we'll leave that one I guess. Adding DLSS quality does allow the CPUs to be locked 30 pretty much, but the 0.1% lows aren't great here, especially with the 5800X. Turning down to standard RT settings, the X3D pulls away a tiny bit, but both are still struggling in 0.1% lows. Turning RT off now, our frame rates are much better, and the 5800X3D now beats the X by 11% with better gains to 1 and 0.1% lows still. Moving down to medium, the X3D increases its lead by 20%, and due to the X not gaining anything in the lows, the 3D is much smoother here, being over 30% faster in both 1 and 0.1% lows. Now we have 1440p and we start with RT enabled, and we can actually hit 30 at RT Ultra now, but 60 is still just a dream. Here the X3D offers a better experience all round, starting to pull away when adding DLSS quality, and giving a nice boost when going down at RT, nearly touching the precious 60, being 26% faster with 31% better 1% lows and a huge 52% better 0.1% lows. Turning off RT now are actually worse than 4K with the 5800X, as the game becomes more CPU limited. We do get a slight boost with the 3D at 1440p though, allowing it to be 28% faster with 26% better 1% lows and 25% 0.1% lows at Ultra, with a similar gap at medium. 1080p we see GPU utilisation as low as mid-50s with RT settings. We're completely CPU limited with the 5800X, showing similar results across all settings. Adding DLSS actually makes the X3D perform worse, although it's still beating the 5800X in nearly every metric at all settings. Turning RT off, we once again see the GPU usage in the mid-50s at Ultra, and dropping to the low 30s at medium, giving us very similar FPS to 4K, even being worse in some areas for the 5800X. The 5800X 3D pretty much matches its 1440p numbers, gaining a few FPS here and losing a few there. This is one of the worst optimised games I've played, and it's mental how little the FPS changes when reducing resolution or settings, being unable to hold 60 FPS with a 4080 even at 1080p with RT enabled. Seems like the whole game's placed on the CPU at times, leaving the GPU to twiddle its fans, if it even turns them on that is. Even the most powerful systems struggle with it. It does look good, but not good enough to warrant a supercomputer to play it. There's some good gains to be had with the X3D model, getting a lot closer to 60 FPS with RT. But with so much load going at the CPUs in this game, they're both being pushed beyond the means. There's always DLSS 3 I know, but you honestly shouldn't need it in this case. I also benchmarked Fortnite and Warzone 2 with these setups, but both games were updated after my testing, so the results will be different now. But I'm sure the overall behaviour will be somewhat similar, although the update may have closed the gaps between the CPUs a little, or made them even bigger. So I thought I'd still include a little bit of info anyway, as a loose idea of what you could expect.
In Fortnite with Lumen enabled, the X3DS's biggest lead was 22% in 4K low, 22% in 1440p low and 26% at 1080p low settings, with some great boosts to 1% lows, although the gaps did close a lot when going up in graphics settings. In Warzone 2 I recorded max gains of 42% at 4K minimum settings, between 14 and 33 boosts at 1440p and between 20 and 38% extra FPS at 1080p with the X3D. Although, Season 2 has altered the 3DS's performance a lot, as you can see in my previous video, so these numbers may have changed a lot too. When using the 4080 we see some good gains from the 5800 X3D, especially at 1440, so if you like turning everything up to 10, want a nice boost to your max frame rate in online multiplayer when every millisecond counts, or just want a bit of extra smoothness, the X3D could be for you. It is the better CPU here, and depending on what games you play it can give you a massive boost to performance, but it does lose out on rare occasions too. If you play at 1440p now or intend to in the future when the 4080 is starting to struggle at 4K, the 5800 X3D could be an even better addition to your system, as you'll find yourself more limited at 1440p and below. The 5800X is still pretty strong though, and doesn't completely bottleneck the 4080. Depending on what games you play and what settings you use, it could be all you need. Anyway, hope you enjoyed the video and it helped you to make a decision if either of these combos are for you. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more. Next up I'll have my Cyberpunk benchmark using this same system here. I was going to include it in this data but there's just so much of it, it warranted its own video. It's a real deep dive using RT on and off and more settings in between. Subscribe so you don't miss out. Thanks, have a good one, bye.